It is 1:15. So welcome to True Language Arts for Special Needs. My name is Cheryl Swope. I'm the author of Simply Classical, A Beautiful Education for Any Child. If you have not yet read the book, we have it down at the vendor. If you are parenting, teaching, grandparenting a child with special needs, and you want that child to receive the benefits of a classical education, this is currently the book on that topic. I am the author of the book. The book was published 5 years ago by Memoria Press, for which I am very grateful. From that came a Simply Classical curriculum that people can use with children who have special needs. Usually that is done in more of a tutorial setting right now, such as in a homeschool. We have a school that's starting on the East Coast that will be doing the Simply Classical curriculum with children who have Down syndrome. But for inclusion, you would not necessarily want a separate curriculum. However, for say a pull-out program for your school, that could work in a resource setting. I am kind of curious. I did not think that this topic would draw more than just 3 or 4 people. So I'm curious as to why you all are here. How many work in a school? Wow. Like 97%. How many are homeschooling a child with special needs? Okay. And okay, how many parents a child with, or grandparents of a child with special needs? Okay. So I want to make sure that this talk matches what you are hoping to find. Are you hoping to get some tips for inclusion of children with special needs? Okay, that's a different talk, which I'm getting ready to, I'm preparing for a school in Denver. It's a large classical school that is just beginning to integrate intentionally children with Down syndrome as a pro-life Christian message to the community. Do not abort these children. Let us love them, embrace them, and teach them. So inclusion is definitely something that we inherited from 1975 onward with public legislation. 1975, that was when Public Law 94-142 came about. It was the Education for All Children Act. And not only for all children, but they all had to be educated in the least restrictive environment, so-called. So what that meant was a lot of the rooms that were self-contained rooms were being emptied, and those children went into regular classrooms with mixed results. I happened to be on the leading edge of that back in the 80s in a district that had 12 elementary schools. And we did this not just with children who had learning disabilities. I was actually the one in charge of behavior disorders. So we had 3 rooms, self-contained, of children who had severe enough behavior disorders that they had gone through the whole process of testing and diagnosis and determination that they did in fact have a significant behavior problem that warranted placement in a separate setting. But along comes mainstreaming at the time. That was the word before inclusion. And we decided that these children would be better off if they were not taught in an aggregate of other children with behavior problems, but instead had good models to learn from. So then we had different modifications of that law, and it eventually became the IDEA Act. But we still have all those remnants of inclusion. So parents expect it, and our mindset is to include, for better or worse. So I will adapt here because you really do need to know what to do to make this work. So let's get a breakdown of ages. Who has K through 3? Okay, who has 4th through, say, 7th? And who's high school? Okay, but high school's at home. Yeah. All right. Okay, well, let's first we'll just start with a little bit of a primer. I think what I'd like to do is leave more time than I expected for questions and answers. I think a lot of you will be able to help each other, and we can talk about real solutions for the things that you face. One other question, how many administrators here do we have? So people who can actually make decisions about placement. Okay, that's helpful too. All right, so there are many ways in which language is affected by a child's special needs. In our own home, we have twins. They came to us as babies, a boy and a girl, real twins. At the same moment, they became our children. And they both had a lot of things that impacted their language. My daughter had a semantic pragmatic language disorder. So even in toddlerhood, she was seeing a language therapist. Words did not make any sense to her. And she didn't know if something was a living object or not. So if she bumped into a chair, she would say, "Excuse me." If she had her cup of milk, she'd say, "Good morning, milk." And then words came out kind of in a tumble. There was a lot of chaos in her mind and in her language. My son had what we usually think of when you go to a speech and language therapist. He had difficulty actually articulating words. So his language or his speech was more garbled and unintelligible. And so both of them saw a language therapist very early on. My first piece of advice is, if you really suspect that you have language or speech issues, that the child has these issues, help the parent to see that. The best way that I have found is to say, "I know he can learn, but I feel like there's something getting in the way of his learning. Have you ever considered a formal evaluation of his speech and language to see if maybe things can be unlocked, and then we can make some progress?" So speech and language disorders, certainly. There's expressive, the way that the child expresses language. And then there's receptive, when language is not making sense when it's going in. Both of those things can be addressed through private speech and language therapy. What I would love to see, maybe in another 5-10 years, is what some of our private schools have, is that they have on-site speech and language therapists. That would be ideal. You get to observe right in the classroom. The child doesn't have to go anywhere else. But in our situation, our classical school had said, "No, we cannot take your children at all in any way." So they were not enrolled in a school. We homeschooled them. And then I just did the therapy privately. We went to our children's hospital, and that's where we found a wonderfully classically educated nun who was no nonsense. And my daughter was only 2, but she expected that these word cards that she sent home would be used, that I would match horse and colt and cow and calf, and I would teach her all of the names. And my daughter couldn't come up with names or words a lot of time. Like I said, it would be garbled. So Sister Marita, whom I just loved, she said, "Teach her so many words that she'll have a veritable thesaurus at her fingertips." So that was my task, is to just teach lots and lots of words, good vocabulary. So in a way, the language arts for special needs are no different than they are for anyone else. I didn't test these to see which ones work. The blue does not. If this is Pastor Kaiser's room, I'll bet he doesn't use purple much. So we'll see. Oh, well. All right, so grammar. Dialectic and rhetoric. The very same language arts that we are looking for from all of our children, we're looking for with our children with special needs. The biggest difference is that we have to take a longer time or pull out through tutoring with the foundation of this. As you primary teachers know, if the child is not hearing sounds, then learning to read phonics is very hard. So there are programs, there's actually a program called Foundations in Sounds that parents can administer. I think both of those are plural, but if you look it up, you'll see it. The phonological awareness that learning about rhyme and sounds and all of the pre-reading things, those things have to go on longer, for a longer period of time than for most children. Most children, when they learn to read, if they have a semester of good ear training, and you play lots of good phonics games, then they'll be ready to read. But with our children, you really have to spend much more intentional time on this phonological, we call it, awareness, meaning the awareness of sounds. Do words rhyme? Can you list a bunch of words in the at family? This is the precursor to reading. Reading is the precursor to grammar. In the tutorial model, like homeschooling, you have the flexibility to stay where they need to be for a longer time. In the classroom, you have to be a little more creative. So what the biggest inclusion tip is just to be multisensory. The research backs it up. You have children who will benefit even if language isn't their primary issue. Being multisensory means that you do the same thing, but in different ways. Multimodal is another term. I recently observed at Highlands Latin School, just got to spend the whole day. It's a private Latin school in Louisville. They do very good things. They don't have any children identified in the early grades with any special need because it is so traditional in the best sense, meaning they do lots of standing recitations, and then they sit, and then they play a game with the same words, and then she has a chart, and she goes through and points, like say they're learning the OA vowel team. She'll do boat, coat, and they go all the way through, float, and sometimes then she'll line them up, and they go through all of those, and then they sit down, and then they stand up, and they're just doing lots of different things. They come to the board, they underline parts of the word. She might have at, and then she has just very rapid fire, has a student come up and put a new letter to make a new word. Those sorts of things, letter tiles, all help. In the classroom where I was, actually this was a different run, same school. Every child had a mini whiteboard and a sock and a marker. And that helps for the kids who are not yet really that coordinated with their fine motor skills. They can't do the worksheets very well, but she could write cat, and then everybody could write cat with their marker, and then they take their sock and they wipe it off. Some of the kids wore their socks and then used it that way. But all of those multisensory things engage kids who have attention problems, language problems, the beginnings of learning disabilities. and the ones that just plain are not ready. They're just immature, and they need it to come in a whole lot of different ways. Same thing for the older students. Way back when I was doing this mainstreaming program, I had this one favorite teacher. Her name was Anne, and she made it work for anybody that I put in that room. And I will say that attitude, love, compassion is really everything. I found in those 12 elementary schools, I could have the smartest teacher in the building, but if she didn't want my child in there, then it was not going to work. On the flip side, the ones who were capable, even just at a modest level of capability, if they were willing to make it work, they would figure out a way to make it work. They might have the child sit closer to them. They might develop a little cue for being on task that was quiet, like just a little tap as they walk around. They could just figure out a way. Behavior's a little bit easier than academics, because if you're really behind in academics, then that's when you may need a different administrative strategy. But anyway, the multisensory for the upper grades. So this teacher, Anne, when they were going to line up, she did not have a mad dash to the door. She did everything systematically. And so that order was amazing for my kids who even had really significant problems in other settings. They just fell right into place. So, and she knew too, she was just so intuitive. She knew whom to have line up in what order. So she wouldn't put a rowdy person and then a rowdy person. And so she did it by like states and capitals, I remember. So she would just say Arkansas, and that person would go. But she didn't pick somebody who would be all handsy if it was my student. Or if my student couldn't stand in line a long time, she'd have that boy, often a boy, just stay in his seat, and then maybe he would be picked toward the end because he would do better in his desk than he would being lined up already waiting for everybody else to do that. Okay, other things that impact language, auditory processing disorder. That is becoming more common. And really what it means is the child typically can hear just fine. Acuity is fine. So if you went to a normal audiologist, they would say his hearing is fine. But it's the ability to process the information that he hears. Some audiologists specialize in this. It's the child who you might give a direction to, and then if you were to have him repeat it, very little would come back. So for that child, it's a really good habit to begin to write any direction up on the board. For the older ones, they can keep a notebook of instructions. A peer, often a girl who you think, oh, this girl would be a good teacher when she grows up, maybe might be the scribe for that older student to help organize. Sometimes you can have a volunteer, be a shadow. I believe they have that scenario at Faith Lutheran right here, where there's a child who benefits from having a paid shadow. And in that case, like an aide, the parents actually have paid for that so that the child is able to remain in the school. You might have volunteers, say a homeschooling mom who has just enrolled your children, but she's kind of squirmy, not knowing what to do with herself. Maybe she could come and shadow that person. So there are different workarounds with the person who does not hear well, the auditory processing. And they can also identify that and tell the child that that's what's going on. My son, they tested his auditory processing at the 1 percentile. So he was maybe 7 or 8, and only 1% of children his age would score lower on that test of auditory processing than he did. So even today, we have a board, and his chores are on the board. It would be silly for me to rattle off a list of things I expect him to do. He wouldn't keep them in his mind. So we have those on the board by day. It's Wednesday, I put the date up on the board, I put the order of the day, and I'll go over it, but then he has something to refer to. So if you have kids with language issues, you have to get in the habit of making it visual and auditory, pairing those things. The paraphrase is a very good little technique to have somebody repeat what you have said. And it could be that student, so you're sure that he knows what is expected. Other things that impact language, of course, specific learning disabilities like dyslexia. There are language components that affect these children. Not just with reading, but often with writing, oral language, and even the language of mathematics sometimes. Mental health issues, we're seeing a lot of children who are anxious or depressed, whether that has to do with the proliferation of screens in their free time or just isolation or what, we don't know, but anxiety, even perfectionism, those sorts of things can impact the student in a classroom. Fetal alcohol syndrome is a big factor in brain impairment. We see that a lot with some of our children who have been adopted. And of course, Down syndrome, any kind of intellectual disability where the actual IQ is lower, that too. Okay, so 7 tips for such a child. And many people, including or cognitive neuroscientists, believe that these 7 things help more than just the child who is in your room that you're concerned about. Actually can improve the performance of the entire classroom. So you do not have to feel like, why am I spending all this time on this one child? You're really not. You're just making yourself a better teacher all around for everybody who's in there. A good book is Milton Gregory's 7 Laws of Teaching. 7 Laws of Teaching. That was Pastor William Heine's favorite go-to book for teachers who wanted to learn how to teach classically, didn't necessarily need all the theory, just needed to know what to do in the classroom to be more effective. That book is in a lot of different versions, but it's the 7 Laws of Teaching by, it might be John Milton Gregory, yeah. But here are 7 quick tips without reading a whole book. Number 1, provide more review than the curriculum calls for. So the number 1 thing is more review. Again, when I was observing at Highlands Latin School, part of the reason was I modified their curriculum to create our Simply Classical curriculum. And I wanted to see how it was implemented in the best possible way before I modified it. I was shocked. Every class in every subject, whether it was Latin or phonics or English grammar, started with a review of what had been done the day before. And that's not always in the teacher manuals, but that's what they do. They do that through recitation. Some of them had students hop on one foot while they're reciting, then switch, hop on the other foot. Or they might do it in a different voice. Let's recite like Daddy and he's stomping, or older students, of course, can just have poised recitations, but for the younger ones, that's an oral, A-U-R-A-L, review that gets them all reviewing, all on the same page. They're not embarrassed, but they get the review even if they aren't keeping up themselves. So more review. Number 2, more explanation. So rather than just assuming that everybody got it because a quarter of the class got it the first time you went through it, go ahead and explain it a different way. Just to be sure. More review, more explanation. Number 3, more multisensory ways to teach and overteach. More multisensory ways to teach and overteach for what we sometimes call overlearning or true mastery. So my cue for this is ask the obvious, meaning you already know that they know what 2 plus 2 is or what the capital of Arkansas is. You already know that they know that, but you're just over teaching to make sure that it's really going into that long-term memory, that it's not just hovering in the short-term memory. And again, that benefits everybody. Number 4, we found this very helpful in our home. Enrichment in nonfiction and fiction. Enrichment in nonfiction and fiction, vocabulary and concept development. Vocabulary and concept development through read-alouds. Enrichment in nonfiction and fiction, vocabulary, concept development, and read-alouds. Or through read-alouds. The idea there is that we're often really good about reading our children storybooks, but some of our children like how-to books, especially those who are on the autism spectrum, the higher functioning, who just love quirky tidbits of information. My son is in that camp, and some of you may know, most of you are new though from the last time I was here, that my son had a deep interest, still does, in regional history. We live in a French colonial town, and he loved reading about our town. We're on the Mississippi River in Missouri. He would get the books from our historical museums and read those. And then he would be so excited, he'd try to tell the other boys in Scouts or wherever, or in our homeschool swim, all these fascinating things. And of course, they had no use for all of that. Well, when he was 14, our local history museum opened up a class for homeschoolers, and it was run by a woman who, she was the director of this museum. She had taught in public school, taught in private Christian school, and had homeschooled, and she had a background in special needs. And I felt like we were really already too busy, but I had to put my son in this class. So he went to this class, ate up everything. She loved his enthusiasm for what she was teaching. He loved to be taught it. It was just a perfect match. He had to volunteer there 30 hours as part of the class. So he got experience in having to dress well, having to smell in a presentable way, having to have your shoes tied, your shirt on, not backwards. But he also learned about history in that context. It was perfect for him. And that was his first paid job then. He ended up being a junior archivist at this museum, developed a system for cataloging the artifacts that they would find on the grounds, and he actually gave tours in the History Museum because all of a sudden he had people who wanted to know the entire history about that antique chair. The nonfiction builds vocabulary for our students for whom language doesn't come easily. You can read books about trees, about birds. We have a whole science and enrichment read aloud set that I include at different levels of our special needs curriculum. But I mean, you can just find anything in your nonfiction children's section and just begin to read those after lunch or whenever time permits. It's one of those 10 to 15 minute sort of things if you have that time in your day. If not, they can be assigned as summer reading for your parents or both. So more review, more explanation, more multisensory, enrichment in nonfiction and fiction. And number 5, extending their education past 18, considering going to 19 or even 21. This is not for every student, of course, but in the public schools, that's what they do often, depending on the state. It takes the pressure off of the dialectic and rhetoric needing to be accomplished by 18. You can have a little bit more time in grammar. If you're in a school that does block scheduling, how many are? Where everybody in the building is studying mathematics at the same time, or Latin at the same time. Well, that's an administrative call, of course. There's another school that I have worked with quite a bit, Immaculata. They happen to be a Catholic school, but Immaculata Classical Academy. They are full inclusion from preschool through high school. It is, for them, it's an ideological or a philosophical, almost a moral conviction for them that everybody stays in the regular classroom. Well, that works very well when you're 4, but as you progress, it's much harder. So they had to go to a block schedule. So at 9 o'clock, everybody studies Latin. And you just go wherever you need to go. This also solves the problem of what to do with that 6th grader who's coming into your school brand new and has never had any classical education. He can go to first form Latin or whatever it is that you use as your base. And everybody's switching, so nobody really notices. It also gives you an opportunity for your students who may one day become real classicists, classical scholars. They can advance if they need to. And then everybody studies math. Could you close that door? And literature, the same way. They all use the literature program from Memoria, so those literature guides and the novels. Some of the students can't read at the grade level, so they switch and they go to the literature that's more suited for their age and ability. So in that sort of a setting, or homeschooling, extending the age of graduation may be a possibility. Maybe in other settings too. And number 6, spending more time at the grammar level. We talked about spending more time at the foundation, but then spending more time at the grammar level. Now that can be accomplished through tutoring. There's a classical school, Veritas Classical, I think they're in North Carolina, and their teachers, anybody who wants to earn a little extra money, their teachers can sign up for before school or after school tutoring. And they offer this year-round. And the parents then can pay, if they don't want to do this tutoring themselves, they can pay, and the child goes to either before or after school for their tutoring. That's when you can go back over what is a noun, what is a verb. You can do what I call horizontal extension of a curriculum, where you're stretching it out, and maybe you use a whole different program even, because he's just not ready to keep going up in a rigorous way, in a linear way. So he goes horizontally through tutoring. Or his reading. or his composition could be addressed that way. And then summer programs can also allow for remaining at those levels, shoring it all up for the next year to go forward. And number 7, so we have more review, more explanation, more multisensory, nonfiction and fiction, extending education beyond 18 possibly if needed, because some of our children, they are immature in addition to having learning difficulties, so it really benefits them in all kinds of ways. And if they go to the community college, they're not likely to get the true language arts anyway. So if they remain where you are, that can be helpful. And then number 6 was spending more time at the grammar level. Number 7, this really is the top. Find the student's strength, or strengths, plural. Try to find the child's strengths in any and every other area than the ones that he struggles. You can learn the child that way for your own benefit so that you feel better about seeing him the next morning. But then you can also help him to learn about himself. When my son started working at that history museum, he stood so much taller. Things changed. He was no longer what he called the dump truck of the family. Now he had his own thing, and he was truly good at it in a quirky kind of a way, but it worked really, really well as long as that director was there, because he loved history. I believe that's because of his liberal arts education. I'm not sure he would have loved history from a different approach. I always like to say that it's ironic. People say the liberal arts are so useless, and they've said that since the time of Socrates. Those are useless studies. But he actually got a job through the liberal arts. So find the strengths in spite of the challenges. He needs to know what they are too. Each of us has challenges, but each of us is also fearfully and wonderfully made. And is he baptized? He's a child of God. That trumps everything. Okay, just quickly, because I think it's important, even though this is your nap time lecture, after lunch, it's awfully hard. Wherever the student is, in your tutoring or in your consulting with a family, you want to go back to wherever he really needs to be. It might be pre-reading. Maybe he never really got those sounds, and that's why the phonics, he can't decode a new word in 4th grade because he really never mastered phonics. He just learned to read through the context and just kind of faked his way through. But now he's encountering multisyllabic words and he doesn't have that phonological awareness. So you go back and you find the high interest, low vocabulary, decodable readers, and you just hit those hard. So pre-reading, these categories I'm borrowing from Dr. Daniel Copeland at Hillsdale College, a friend in the field of education. So we have pre-reading, then we have learning to read. Maybe he's still at the learning to read stage. Maybe he needs more work with fluency. So that's what you target during the pull-out session. Some schools have in-school pull-outs, like a resource room is what we called it. in the public school. That can be equipped with somebody who has experience in your school with remedial reading, somebody who has a special ed background, somebody who just is kind and willing to listen to the child read. It could be that if he's really in this stage, he might not be ready for Latin because the vowels are different, and it might be that he needs to work on this and take another year before he starts Latin, and that could be his pull-out time. There are different ways to do it, but wherever he is, that's what you want to hit. Now, a lot of children and their parents will say, he's 11. I don't want to go back to pre-reading or learning to read. But what I like to do is encourage them to get a whole bunch of blocks and put one little square at the bottom, and then try to build a great big tower off of that one little square and watch it all collapse. And then put the blocks in a big, firm foundation, and then see how tall you can build. And just tell them this is just for a season. We are building that foundation. For whatever reason, we didn't give it to you, or somehow it happened that you don't have a foundation yet. But in order to go as big as you can go, we've got to make that foundation strong. After these are solid, hopefully about 3rd grade is when we want that. Then you move to the rest, which really takes you into the upper levels, the reading to learn. There are still workarounds here. The number one, audiobooks. There are a lot of programs now. Learning Ally is one. If you have a diagnosis, you can get audiobooks for free. Of course, Audible has them. You want to find the best readers you can find. Sometimes a parent or grandparent, again, might volunteer to read a textbook or a novel that you can't find in an audio version. It's not cheating to let him read it along with the audiobook. It helps. Because maybe his IQ is high enough, he can get the content. It's just that his reading isn't quite there. So that's the number one workaround for books. The other one is testing orally in the subjects that don't involve reading. So if it's science, mathematics, and he just can't get it all down on paper, all you really want to know is, does he know the content? Then you can test him orally. I mean, is it a modification? Of course, but it's a twofold thing: modifications or accommodations and remediation. If you just have modifications, then it doesn't sit well with the other students or the other parents. But if you're also working really hard at remediation, then you're trying to bring him up. You're not just taking care of the adaptations. And overarching all of this in our last 2 minutes is the Holy Scripture. One of my favorite passages is when John the Baptist was leaping in the womb of Elizabeth. He was nonverbal, as far as we know, had no language yet. And yet, the Holy Spirit was able to impress upon his heart that Christ was present. That's the hope that we can give these parents, the hope that we can give ourselves, that God's word will still, no matter where they are, will still do its work. I have 2 poems that my daughter, the one who had the severe language disorder in the beginning, but who received a classical Christian education all the way through, classical Lutheran education. She's now 23, as is my son. She has published 2 small books of what she calls fireside poetry. She likes to come with me, but she can't often come with me to conferences, so she sent these 2. The First one is called Child. Pitter-patter of little feet dance across the floor. Sorrows, joys, and daydreams now are no more. A gust of wind, a shadow, the morrow brings to say. Remorse, sadness, joy, surrender, all there ever was to pay. Night falls as she rises. The Savior lends a hand. Talitha Kumi, young lady, rise and live again. The next one is called Help. You can hear the theology of the cross in her language now also. Help. Save us now, God's chosen race, from this unglorious, sinister place. A mean allotment is our view from sin, distraction, bereavement too. Save us now by your mighty hand. Lead us now to your chosen land. Dismay, despair, keen alloy, plot to take our every spoil. Spare us, Lord, and with your grace, lead us where we will be safe. Angels hearken now to see. Rain has fallen over thee. God be with us in thy quest. Here comes Jesus, eternal rest. Thank you.